Boy, oh boy. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. There's some pretty interesting goings on in the movie business, Hollywood, TV, show business in general, and indeed society in general these days, aren't there? Ever since these Harvey Weinstein sexual assault allegations surfaced just a few weeks ago, there's just been this never-ending line of mighty statues with feet of clay. All these, in some cases, legendary figures from show business, politics, and other fields of endeavor, not only in American society, but to some extent around the world, who are just dropping like flies, one by one, to various allegations and revelations of sexual misconduct of one kind or another from their pasts. First Harvey Weinstein, then Kevin Spacey, who somehow managed to find the one way of coming out of the closet as a gay man after decades of rumors swirling around him.
Help! I've escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement! Help me!
That actually managed to incur not only the wrath of people who are in the anti-gay camp, but even the gay community and its supporters themselves. Wow. I don't know how he managed to pull that one off. Now you've got women coming out and saying that Louis C.K., a comedian of whom I've been a fan in the past, actually sexually harassed them by masturbating in front of them? I mean, what in the hell? Now, maybe I shouldn't be that surprised in Louis C.K.'s case. A lot of his comedy has been rather raunchy over the years. And I'm not gonna lie, that's been one of the reasons why I've been a fan of it. He's been very open and honest about his own foibles, particularly in the realm of sexual desire. All this time, I thought he was just kidding. I mean, I'm sure he was telling the truth about his sex drive and the male sex drive in general. I thought this was just his way of, poking fun, good-naturedly, at the male sex drive itself, as well as a lot of other foibles in everyday life that are pertinent and relevant to the issue of sex and relations between the genders. Apparently I was wrong. Who knew this guy was actually engaging in just doing this kind of dirt behind the scenes the whole time? Well, it's interesting that I should phrase my rhetorical question in that way because as a matter of fact, a number of people did know, and not just his victims either. They actually revealed what he did to a number of people in the past. And they were stonewalled, they were met with silence. Some people believed them, some didn't. But I'll say this for Louis C.K. At least he did have the decency, such as it is, to make a statement in which he acknowledged that he did these things. He hasn't denied it. He hasn't consciously tried to downplay it. In fact, I would say, in fairness to him, he hasn't really tried to downplay it at all. But there's still some flaws in the statement that he put out. Although he made an apology of sorts, and he seemed to try to own up to what he'd done, and to admit that it was terribly, terribly wrong, his statement itself was still problematic in a number of ways. There's one blog post that has already deconstructed his statement and identified ways in which to make it into a real apology, or so they've said. On the whole, I would say that a guy who's capable of doing what he did in the first place was bound to hit at least some of the wrong notes in making any apology, and so while it's good that they've sort of lain bare some of the shortcomings even of his statement, I would still give him a modicum of credit for making it in the first place, especially knowing the professional consequences that are already resulting. But there's one aspect of his statement that I wanted to tackle. It pertains to the issue of consent. What it means, how to get it, and how to proceed, how to tell whether or not you've gotten it before you proceed with any kind of sexual encounter with anyone, but particularly if you're a man and she's a woman, and most of all, if you have any kind of professional relationship with each other. Now let me read briefly from the text of Louis C.K.'s apology statement. I want to address the stories told to the New York Times by 5 women named Abby, Rebecca, Dana, and Julia who felt able to name themselves and one who did not. These stories are true. At the time, I said to myself that what I did was okay because I never showed a woman my you-know-what without asking first, which is also true. But what I learned later in life, too late, is that when you have power over another person, asking them to look at your you-know-what isn't a question. It's a predicament for them. The power I had over these women is that they admired me, and I wielded that power irresponsibly. Now here's the thing. Louis, it's good that you recognize that what you did was wrong. It's good that you're admitting to it instead of trying to cover it up. But at the same time, did you really reach full adulthood without learning that when you ask someone for permission, you don't actually have permission unless they give it to you? That you don't just go through the motions of asking for permission and then just go right ahead and do whatever it is that you want to do, that you're ostensibly asking them if you can do, without waiting for an answer? Did you really not already know that before you had these sordid encounters with these women? That's the problem here. If you actually look at the accounts of the way these incidents played out, you'll see that in most of them, Louis C.K. did not really wait to get an answer to his question before he proceeded to start pleasuring himself manually in front of these women, or sometimes over the phone. For example, if you look at the New York Times articles that revealed a number of these incidents, consider this. In 2002, a Chicago comedy duo, Dana Min Goodman and Julia Wolof, landed their big break, a chance to perform at the U.S. Comedy Arts Festival in Aspen, Colorado. When Louis C.K. invited them to hang out in his hotel room for a nightcap after their late-night show, they did not think twice. The bars were closed and they wanted to celebrate. He was a comedian they admired. The women would be together. His intentions seemed collegial. As soon as they sat down in his room, still wrapped in their winter jackets and hats, Louis C.K. asked if he could take out his penis, the women said. They thought it was a joke and laughed it off. And then he really did it, Miss Goodman said in an interview with the New York Times. He proceeded to take all of his clothes off and get completely naked and started masturbating. In 2003, Abby Schachner called Louis C.K. to invite him to one of her shows, and during the phone conversation, she said she could hear him masturbating as they spoke. Another comedian, Rebecca Corey, said that while she was appearing with Louis C.K. on a television pilot in 2005, he asked if he could masturbate in front of her. She declined. Miss Corey, a comedian, writer, and actress, has long felt haunted by her run-in with Louis C.K. In 2005, she was working as a performer and producer on a television pilot, a big step in her career, when Louis C.K., a guest star, approached her as she was walking to the set. He leaned close to my face and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes, Miss Corey said in a written statement to the New York Times. He asked if we could go to my dressing room so he could masturbate in front of me. Stunned and angry, Miss Corey said she declined, pointed out that he had a daughter and a pregnant wife. His face got red, she recalled, and he told me he had issues. I'll say, issues? That's putting it rather mildly. Louis. You really thought it was cool even to ask these women if you could masturbate in front of them in the first place? Now that's one area in which your statement admitted you were wrong. But it's still pretty twisted to think that you only came to that realization belatedly. Maybe you didn't only just realize it now that these women have come forward. Maybe you realized it years ago and just didn't have the guts to come out about it until now. You had to be pressured or pushed into doing it by their revelations. But even so, you were a grown-ass man when this happened. How did you not already know that when you ask someone for permission, you can't just go ahead and do what you're asking to do until they say yes, or otherwise clearly communicate an affirmative response? I mean, damn, kids know that. Look at it this way. If you're driving down the street, you're stopped at a red light, and one of those damn squeegee kids comes up to your car and offers to wash your windshield for 50 cents or whatever, if they just go ahead and wash your windshield anyway, even though you wave no and say no thank you, would you then feel obligated to pay them the 50 cents that they were asking for just because they did the job for you? Just because they ostensibly asked you first? I know I wouldn't. I'd tell them to go to hell. If I told you no, then you didn't have my consent, my permission to wash my damn windshield. The transaction isn't really a transaction at all because it's not voluntary. We didn't both enter into it of our own free will. At least I didn't. Therefore, there is no deal, there is no bargain, there is no contract, there is no transaction. In the case of any kind of sexual interaction, the stakes are, of course, much higher. You can't just ask a woman, "Can I do this sexual thing with you or in your presence?" and then just go ahead and do it. What's the point of even asking if you're not going to wait for her expression of assent, of consent? What's the point of even asking? You're just jumping through certain perfunctory hoops. You're not actually going to let the possibility that she's not with it stop you from going ahead and doing it, from doing exactly what you want to do anyway. That's foul, no matter how you slice it. And the fact that you did this with women with whom you had an actual or at least potential professional relationship just makes it that much worse. I don't think it's cool even to ask this kind of thing of a woman under these kinds of circumstances, even if you don't have any kind of professional rapport with her. I mean, you can't just go from 0 to 100 right out of the gate like that. If you're having a non-sexual conversation or other interaction with a woman, you can't just out of the blue ask her if it's cool for you to strip buck naked and masturbate in front of her. What the hell is up with that? I mean, if you guys are already having some kind of consensual sexual encounter, and then you ask her if you can take it there, that's at least arguably a different story. So if you guys were already making out, again, consensually, you were already petting each other, necking, doing God knows what else, anything up to and including full-blown sexual intercourse, then you ask her, you mind if I get naked and jack it in front of you? That's a different story. And of course, even then, you still have to wait for her to say yes or otherwise clearly communicate to you that she's down. But for you to just be having a conversation with her about business, about work, or even about anything else under the sun other than sex, and then just come out randomly with, by the way, you want to watch me jack off? I'm sorry, but that is just beyond foul. And I think it's not just disgusting and inappropriate, but it does constitute sexual harassment. Even if it's not necessarily the kind of sexual harassment that deserves to be punished legally, it definitely deserves condemnation, as well as public opinion-related consequences, such as losing business, which is exactly what is happening to Louis C.K. and Harvey Weinstein and a number of these other characters whose predatory nature is finally being exposed. Now, this is no game, folks. This is important stuff, serious stuff. You got Roy Moore, the Republican Alabama Senate candidate, who's now been accused of engaging in very inappropriate sexual harassment, I would say, of teenage girls decades ago. And what's happened? In Alabama, the supposed buckle of the Bible Belt, are the folks down there in this deep red Bible-believing state doing the right thing? Are they saying, ugh, we don't want to have anything to do with a man who would engage in that kind of activity? Oh no, they're rallying around him. Because they don't mind throwing their support to a sex offender as long as it means keeping a Democrat out of the Senate. I mean, how disgraceful is that? When you consider that Moore's Senate opponent is a man who actually helped prosecute the Ku Klux Klansmen who committed the 1963 bombing, the terrorist attack, the white supremacist terrorist attack that murdered 4 young black girls on a Sunday morning at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. This is the man who helped put some of those guys behind bars. And yet, this kind of man is someone you consider so reprehensible that you can't stomach the idea of him representing you in the Senate, and you would rather have a sex offender represent you in the Senate than him, just because he's a Democrat and you're a Republican? What? That's taking partisanship to absolutely disgusting depths. That's the kind of political climate that exists in the United States these days, I guess. I don't know. All I know is I don't want to hear any more from any of those socially conservative, family values, traditional values Republicans on that front. Because if they're willing to stand by a man like Roy Moore, with the allegations that have been made behind him, with the weight and the substance that's used to back up those allegations, then clearly it's not really about morality for them. Either that or their idea of morality is badly twisted up. So when we live in a kind of society where this kind of sexual misconduct is still so commonplace, where people are still out there doing that kind of dirt, and of course predominantly men, this is a major problem that we all need to tackle. It's everybody's business.